In the winter of 1944, in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, a German infantry squad opened fire on an American position with 5 bolt-action rifles. Each man worked his bolt, fired, worked it again. Across the clearing, 8 Americans answered, and every one of them kept firing. No bolts, no pause, just round after round, 8 to a clip, faster than the German squad could match. By the time the smoke cleared, the math had already decided the fight. That imbalance wasn't an accident, and it wasn't limited to one clearing in the Ardennes. It was the result of a decision the U.S. Army had made 8 years earlier, a decision no other major power in the war had made. While Germany, Japan, Italy, Britain, and even the Soviet Union sent their infantry into World War II carrying rifles that had to be hand-cycled after every shot, the United States had already armed its riflemen with something none of them had. A semi-automatic battle rifle, standard issue, millions strong, in the hands of privates as well as officers. It sounds like a small technical difference. A few extra rounds, a faster action, but repeated across an entire army in every engagement for the length of the war, that small difference became one of the quiet structural facts of World War II, one that shaped how infantry battles were fought on every front the United States touched. It was called the M1 Garand, and it would become one of the most consequential weapons of the war, not because of one dramatic moment, but because of what it did quietly in the hands of every American rifleman, every day, for 4 years. The rifle was the work of John Garand, a Canadian-American engineer at Springfield Armory who spent over a decade perfecting a gas-operated, semi-automatic action that could survive mud, sand, and the chaos of combat. The Army adopted it in 1936, making it the first standard-issue self-loading rifle for any major army on Earth. At the time, that decision looked almost reckless. Critics inside the Ordnance Department doubted it could even be mass-produced. Some argued the breech mechanism was simply too complex for assembly line production at the scale a war would demand. Garand answered those doubts the only way that mattered, by designing and building much of the specialized tooling himself, so that when the order finally came to ramp up, the factories were ready to follow it. That stubbornness would matter more than anyone could have guessed in 1936. By 1939, war had already broken out in Europe, and the United States, still technically at peace, began quietly preparing. Springfield Armory increased output. The Army went looking for a second source of production, because one armory, however efficient, would never be enough for what was coming. Then came the war itself, and the real test wasn't the rifle's design anymore. It was whether America could build enough of them, fast enough to matter. By January 1944, Springfield Armory was turning out 122,001 M1 rifles in a single month, nearly 4,000 a day, around the clock, in a facility that just a few years earlier had been producing rifles at a rate of around 100 per day. Over the course of the war, Springfield alone produced more than 3.5 million Garands. Winchester Repeating Arms, brought in as a second manufacturer to meet the Army's demand, added another 500,000. Combined, more than 4 million M1 rifles rolled off American production lines during World War II, a number no Axis nation could touch with any comparable semi-automatic design, because no Axis nation had committed to one in the first place. Picture what that meant on the ground in 1944 and 1945. Nearly every American infantryman in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the snow of the Ardennes, on the beaches and ridgelands of the Pacific, was carrying the same rifle with the same 8-round capacity, the same semi-automatic action. It wasn't a weapon issued to specialists or elite units. It was the rifle, the ordinary, everyday tool of the ordinary American soldier. And that ordinariness is exactly what made it so significant. Germany's Wehrmacht went to war with the Karabiner 98K, a refined, accurate, beautifully made bolt-action rifle, and by most accounts one of the finest of its kind ever built. It traced its lineage back to the Juyer 98 of the First World War, trimmed down and modernized for a new generation of soldiers. 5 rounds in an internal magazine, loaded with a stripper clip, hand-cycled between every shot. Japan's infantry carried the Arasaka, another bolt-action design with its own long pedigree. The Soviet Union issued the excellent semi-automatic SVT-40 to some units, but Soviet planners worried it required too much maintenance for hastily trained conscripts rushed to the front in their millions. So the simple, rugged, bolt-action Massenagent remained the rifle most Red Army soldiers carried throughout the war. Britain stayed with the Lee Enfield, a bolt-action rifle prized for how quickly a skilled soldier could work its action, but an action a soldier still had to work by hand after every round. Even Japan's own engineers eventually built a garand copy, the Type 5, a clear acknowledgement that they recognized what the Americans had. But by the time it reached the prototype stage, Japan's wartime industry was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and blockade. Only around 250 were ever completed before the war ended, a curiosity in a museum case today, a reminder of an advantage Japan saw too late to do anything about. Every one of these rifles had real strengths, and none of them were bad weapons, quite the opposite. The Kar 98K in particular was rugged, accurate, and trusted by the men who carried it, on both sides of the front line when American troops occasionally picked one up. But none of them could do what the M1 Garand did. Let a single soldier fire 8 rounds, one trigger pull after another, without ever touching the action, without that fractional but real pause every other rifleman on the battlefield had to take. Here's what that meant on the ground. A German rifleman fires once, then must work the bolt back, chamber a new round, and re-aim before he can fire again. It takes only a second or two, but in combat, a second or two is an eternity. An American rifleman with a garand fires once and is already aiming his second shot, his rifle's action having done the reloading work for him in the same motion that absorbed the recoil. Multiply that across a squad of 8 or 12 men, and the difference in sustained rifle fire isn't small. It's the difference between a German section that has to pause, collectively and almost rhythmically, to work their bolts, and an American section that, from the enemy's perspective, simply doesn't stop. Military analysts who have studied the small arms balance of the European theater have made the point bluntly. In a close engagement between equal numbers of riflemen, the side with semi-automatic weapons can put down 2 or 3 times the volume of fire in the same window of time. That's not a measure of accuracy, or marksmanship, or courage. German riflemen were every bit as brave and often as well trained as their American counterparts. It's raw tempo. And tempo in an infantry firefight at close range is often the thing that decides who flinches first, who breaks cover first, who survives the next 30 seconds. The U.S. Army understood this wasn't a minor edge. It was a structural one, built into every rifle squad in every theater, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, from the mountains of Italy to the deserts of North Africa. The garand went everywhere the American infantrymen went, and the infantrymen noticed. General George S. Patton certainly did. On January 26, 1945, in the final winter of the European War, Patton sat down and wrote a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell, the Army's Chief of Ordnance. The opening line of that letter has outlived almost everything else Patton ever wrote. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. He went on to praise America's machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks in the same breath. But it was the garand that opened the letter, and the garand's name that survived in history. Patton wasn't a weapons enthusiast writing fan mail. He was a field commander who had just spent years watching what that rifle did in the hands of unconquerable veterans. His words for the men carrying it. To him, the M1 wasn't a curiosity. It was part of the machinery that was grinding the German army down, one rifle squad at a time. And the Germans knew it too. By the middle of the war, German infantry doctrine was built around a different solution to the same problem: the squad machine gun. The MG42, with its terrifying rate of fire, became the heart of every German rifle squad, supplemented later in the war by the early assault rifles like the G44, which gave a select few soldiers a taste of automatic firepower in a rifle-sized package. Where the American squad spread its firepower across 8 or more semi-automatic rifles, the German squad concentrated it in 1 or 2 automatic weapons, with the riflemen around them playing a supporting role, protecting the gun, feeding it ammunition, covering its flanks. It was a different philosophy, and on its own terms it worked. The MG42 was a formidable weapon, feared by Allied troops for good reason. But that concentration of firepower also meant the German squad had a single point of failure. If that one gun went silent, jammed, out of ammunition, or its gunner hit, the German squad's volume of fire didn't just drop. It collapsed. The American squad had no such single point of failure. Every rifleman, individually, was a source of sustained fire. Take out one garand and the squad was diminished by 1/8. Take out the MG42, and for a moment, the German squad's firepower was gutted. There's a reason captured German assessments of American infantry tactics kept circling back to the same observation. U.S. riflemen seemed to fire more, and fire longer, than their numbers should allow. Some of that was doctrine. American training emphasized aggressive use of firepower. But underneath the doctrine was the hardware. You can train a man to fire often. You can't train a bolt-action rifle to fire faster than its action allows. The M1 wasn't perfect, and the men who carried it didn't pretend otherwise. At nearly 10 pounds loaded, it was heavy. The 8-round end block clip meant a soldier couldn't simply top off a partially full magazine. When the clip was in, you fired it dry or ejected it. And the clip's distinctive metallic ping, as it flew free, became part of GI folklore. Some soldiers worried it told a nearby enemy the rifle was empty for a moment. Whether that ever cost an American life in combat is, by the honest accounting of historians and veterans, deeply disputed. For every account of danger, there's another from a veteran who valued the ping as a built-in reminder to reload. What's not disputed is that reloading the garand was fast. A trained rifleman could slap in a fresh clip and be back in action in roughly 2 seconds faster, in practice, than a bolt-action rifleman could chamber even a single new round under fire. So the rifle had quirks. Real soldiers complained about real things: the weight, the clip, the noise. But not one of those complaints changed the fundamental equation. Whatever its flaws, the M1 Garand could put 8 aimed shots downrange before a Kar 98K armed opponent had cycled his bolt twice. And in World War II, that gap, repeated across millions of rifles on every front, for 4 years added up to something enormous. It's tempting to look for one battle, one moment, where the Garand won the war. That's not how it worked, and it's not the honest story. No single firefight turned on the rifle alone. Combined arms, artillery, air power, logistics, and the men themselves all mattered more than any one weapon. But that's exactly what makes the Garand story different from a lot of WWii weapons legends. It wasn't a secret breakthrough or a last-minute miracle. It was a structural advantage, built into the standard kit of every American rifleman, present in every engagement, contributing a little bit every single time. Multiply a little bit by 4 million rifles and 4 years of war, and you get something historians can point to with real confidence. The United States entered World War II as the only major power whose ordinary infantrymen carried a self-loading rifle as standard issue. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, more than 4 million of those rifles had been built, produced at a pace that peaked at over 120,000 in a single month. And the gap they represented, squad by squad, front by front, had been part of the daily reality of the war, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, from the snow of the Ardennes to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. It's easy, looking back at World War II, to focus on the famous weapons, the tanks rolling off assembly lines by the tens of thousands, the bombers blackening the sky over Germany, the carriers steaming toward Japan. The M1 Garand never had that kind of spectacle. There was no single dramatic unveiling, no headline-grabbing debut. It didn't need one. It simply worked in the hands of millions of ordinary soldiers every single day, in a war where every day, every patrol, every ambush, every house-to-house clearing is exactly what mattered. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he wrote those words while there was still fighting left to do. While the rifle's record was still being written in the snow of the Ardennes and the forests of the Rhineland, the men who actually carried it, more often than not, used a humbler word. They called it reliable, and in a war fought one rifle squad at a time on one ordinary morning after another, reliable was the difference that, again and again, tipped the balance and helped bring those soldiers home.